Hi, I'm Josie. Welcome to the Institution series with The Gryphon, LSTV and LSR. I'm here today with Perry and Olivia from the Young Historians Project, and they're here to talk about the project, the events they're working on, and also just the Black Lives Matter movement in general. So would you like to introduce yourselves?
So I'm currently doing my Masters in Modern History here at Leeds. I'm looking particularly at Black British radicalism, particularly after the Second World War. So that's kind of my research specialism.
Yeah, my name's Olivia. I'm also an MA student here at the University of Leeds, and my research looks at Black women's activism in the 1970s and the 1980s in Leeds in particular, and I've been a volunteer with the Young Historians Project since April 2019.
Wow, it sounds very interesting, both of you. So would you like to tell us a bit more about the Young Historians Project? So what is it, how did you both get involved, and what are you aiming to do with it?
So the Young Historians Project is a non-profit organisation which encourages the development of historians of African and Caribbean heritage. We were founded following the History Matters conference of, I think it was 2015, which was a conference set up to look at why so few Black people were taking up history as a subject and also becoming teachers, history lecturers. And they agreed that it was to do with the curriculum and the fact that the young Black people weren't being taught the histories which would kind of motivate them or inspire them to go on to take history as a degree. So the Young Historians Project was established to try and get young Black people aged 16 to 25 involved in history production, history making, and especially oral history interviews. And we kind of have two aims, so to encourage Black people to get involved in history, but to also draw attention to neglected aspects of Black British history. So that's why our current project looks at African women in the British Health Service to kind of shed light on that forgotten part of our history.
Sounds really good. Have you got anything to add?
I joined YHP in particular because I was quite disappointed at the current state of the academy and how they teach history. Looking at Leeds alone, there's only about 40 academic staff in Leeds that are Black, and there are no Black professors at Leeds. And that's just something that I think needs to change, and the only way that can change is through encouraging young Black kids to actually get involved in history, and that's the whole reason why we do the Young Historians Project, because we want to get young Black kids involved in history when currently I think history is the third most unpopular subject with young Black kids. So it's all about getting these kids to realise that history is incredibly important in understanding where we are today.
Yeah, well, as a history student myself, I feel like I really can understand that, and I really find it very encouraging because obviously, I don't know about you, but my experience growing up in school especially, there was not a lot of Black history that was studied. It was mainly the slave trade, and then, Britain abolished the slave trade, how amazing. So I don't know about you, what have your experiences been like growing up, learning about history and Black history especially?
I think particularly here in the UK, my experience of Black history has almost exclusively come, at least through primary and secondary education, has almost exclusively come through Black History Month. And whenever we do Black History Month, I find it quite peculiar because there seems to be a hyper focus almost on the Black history, not of Britain, but the Black history of the United States, in that we often look at civil rights figures like Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, and it almost creates a narrative that racism is a problem that has been solved here through our tolerance as a nation. And I think that is particularly why I'm in favour of integrating Black British history with the British curriculum, because it helps us to see that these issues aren't something that's exclusive to the United States. It very much exists here.
Yeah, and you, Olivia?
I didn't really get the opportunity to study Black history at school, apart from when we looked at slavery and the slave trade in year 9. But even then, as Perry's mentioned, it was framed within like an American setting, and even though we explored Caribbean slavery, it was very much presented as something which happened elsewhere, and completely glossed over the fact that these at the times were British colonies and then technically classed as British land, in it is as much British history as, say, the Victorian era is, because it just took place somewhere else. So I think whilst we were taught some Black history, it was taught in a way of, oh, this is not our history as much, and this is a problem which we've long overcome.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree with that. I feel like it's so important to realise that it is British history. It's not like unrelated to us. Has played a very important role in the history of Britain. So now that you've both completed your undergrad studies, how have you found that it's different at uni, if it is any different, learning about Black history as it was when you were at school?
I think there's a degree of difference. However, I'm still quite concerned in that the fact that last year I took a module in third year called the Histories of Black Britain, and that was the first year that the School of History ran that module. So I think in many ways, while there is opportunity to broaden your knowledge, it's still quite confined, and there's still a lot of progress to be made within the academy itself.
Yeah, I agree with that, because I'm taking that module at the moment as well, and it's the first opportunity I feel like I've had to really like study it, especially when you see there are so many modules on like specific topics, like the amount of opportunity you'd have maybe to study the Tudors or the Victorians, and then to have that one module now, it's good to have it, but is it enough, really?
Well, not even that, just on the topic of race alone, I can study anti-apartheid, I can study race in the United States, I can study colonial India, for example, but the fact that it's taken so long to just get a module on the history of Black Britain, which is such a central history to this nation, I think is something that's quite troubling.
Yeah, and you, Olivia?
I think whilst you do have the opportunity more often now to study Black history, you see it more as an optional module. So I think that you could choose to do the history of Black Britain. But I think at York, I don't know how it was at Leeds undergrad, but in first year you would have some core modules which kind of introduce you to, I think it was like 500 AD all the way to present day, and it was a very broad approach, but it was designed to introduce you to little aspects of history which you would then want to like go and learn more about in second and third year. And in those kind of modules, there was no mention of kind of Black history in Britain, and if it did touch on that history, it was more about decolonisation, and it didn't look at Britain as a post-colonial state. It was more about what happened in the colonies afterwards. You didn't learn about the migrants who came to Britain after independence. So that means that if you are interested in Black history, it's something you've got to motivate yourself to go and learn about.
Yeah, you've got to go out and like actually seek out the Black history.
It's not something which will be introduced to you on a core module. It's something you've kind of got to find in an option module and already have the interest.
Yeah. So I guess we've kind of then already touched on my next question, but what are like some of the changes you'd like to see in the context of the whole decolonising the curriculum in terms of at a school level and at a higher education level? How do you think the curriculum can be improved to include more of the Black history and Black British history in particular?
I'm particularly a fan of integrating Black history with regular history, British history, sorry. I think that Black History Month, while created with good intentions, I think is only a stopgap really in addressing the real issues of how we teach history in this country. I think while it's good that we acknowledge the achievements of notable black people and Black individuals, it's still not enough, and I think that you really need to integrate the history within the already taught curriculum. Otherwise it's contributing to the sort of split between what we consider Black history and British history. There needs to be that integration before we can have any real meaningful change.
Yeah. Anything else?
I think you definitely need more Black histories on the curriculum in general, but we also need to look at the methods behind the history production and introducing, I think, pupils, especially at a young age, to different forms of history production. So one of those is oral histories, which is something we rely on at the Young Historians Project, actually sitting down and speaking to the people who were involved in the histories which we're learning about. And quite often that is a way to learn about history from the perspective of the marginalised, because quite often they don't get the opportunity to tell their own stories, particularly as I think among history academic staff, only 0.5% of them are Black. So you're learning about black history from a very white angle, and you're not being able to speak to some of the people who were involved if you are just relying on a textbook or an archive. So when we run school workshops through the Young Historians Project with different schools, we're starting to teach them more about oral history, and they're always interested to look at the interview transcripts and kind of get a sense of the people who are actually involved. I think that's a key way that we can decolonise our curriculum, is actually decolonising the tools which we use to study history, because the reason why oral history has such a bad reputation is because colonisers at the time didn't see it as a valid form of history because it wasn't written. So not only do we have to decolonise the curriculum through re-evaluating the histories we learn, we need to re-evaluate how we learn those histories and how we teach them.
Yeah.
I agree with Liv there. And just on getting kids interested in history, I think if you spoke to a lot of secondary school age kids and you asked them what they thought about history, a lot of them would have this sort of perception of, you know, dusty old archives and like really old books and dense academic texts, where when the YHP does oral history, it demonstrates that history is something that can actually be quite personal and engaging and actually really like intellectually stimulating, and it doesn't just have to be from these official channels, official in inverted commas channels of creating history through archives which have historically been colonial. If you look at how we create history in this country and the reliance on archives, we have to look at, like Liv said, the factors that go into the production of these histories. And I think that's why YHP is so important, because of our focus on oral history. It's sort of a rejection almost of traditional history making tradition.
Really interesting points from both of you there. I just wanted to talk about as well, obviously it's the government that ultimately can dictate what goes on the curriculum. So I recently attended a talk with historian David Olusoga, if you know him, and he was talking about Black Lives Matter and decolonising the curriculum and the role of public history in doing that. And the government, obviously in light of the events of 2020 and like the real publicity of Black Lives Matter, Perry, I know you've written about this, have spoken about calls to change the curriculum and have said that teaching unsubstantiated accusations against state institutions is harmful to British society. So I just wanted to ask, what do you say to the ideas that the government are pushing forward, that it's unnecessary to reform the curriculum in a more inclusive way for people? What do you say to those sort of ideas?
I think that all comes down to what you think the purpose of history is. And to me, I think that history is as much about learning about the past as it is finding out why we are the way we are today. And I think that if we allow for these conversations to happen about colonialism, about the British Empire, about the construction of race, it allows us to see why are things the way they are today. Rather than being harmful, I think only real meaningful change and real meaningful healing can happen to this country once there is at least an addressal of the histories that have been neglected. I mean, we live in this country as black people, but we're not accepted as part of the traditional historical narrative. And do you not think that in and of itself is harmful? I think rather than the government thinking it's harmful to have these conversations, it's harmful not having these conversations.
Yeah, definitely. Have you got?
I think it's harmful to their presentation of British society, and it's harmful to the agenda which they have, which is to kind of gloss over these social issues which exist within British society, and as we've mentioned before, present it as something which exists elsewhere. I think, like we said, they're trying to present a certain agenda where, although black and Asian people have integrated successfully into British society when most of them came over following the war, so to kind of flag up these issues of activism resistance implies that there was something to resist against. So that's obviously why they would find it harmful.
So as students yourselves, and now that you've completed undergrad, you're obviously postgrad, what do you think that universities can do to further decolonise the curriculum, and also in terms of the wider Black Lives Matter movement?
Well, I think universities can firstly look at the staff who they are employing and trying to make sure that the same diversity they're talking about having in their curriculum they're having amongst their staff as well. Like, as I already mentioned, the lack of diversity amongst academic staff in the history profession alone, I think it's 87% white. So trying to make sure that you're including more voices talk about these histories. Yeah.
Well, yeah, I agree, and also I'd like to add that while we want to see universities employing a more diverse range of staff, these academics have to come from somewhere, and often that place is, secondary school through undergraduate, and I think it's up to the universities, and it's on the universities to actually get out there and encourage these children that don't usually participate in history to try and get involved. So holding talks in secondary schools, trying to get kids interested in history, because if you don't get them interested at a young age, it's very unlikely that they're going to go into academia.
So obviously you've both studied at Leeds and York, that are two very majority white universities. What advice would you give to young people of colour, young black people who are thinking of joining or have just joined these universities? What advice would you give to them about being at university when it is predominantly white?
I think you've got, advice I'd give to students is to be prepared for cultural ignorance at times, because obviously with our curriculum not being that diverse, that means a lot of young people don't get the opportunity to learn about as many cultures. So when you kind of go to university and wherever background you've come from, you've got to be prepared that some people may ask you questions about it, maybe not very nice questions, and the main thing is to then finding those support networks afterwards. So it may be that you want to join a society where you can celebrate your culture, say maybe the African Caribbean Society, for example, which I think York and Leeds both have. I would recommend joining those organisations because there can be spaces where you can talk about these experiences which you've had, and also think about ways you can overcome problems if you ever encounter them, whether it's in the university itself or in houses or student accommodation.
And you, Perry?
Yeah, no, I agree completely. I also think that it's important to, while you might not have that access here, it's important to seek out organisations such as the Young Historians Project that I looked for. That it's important to seek out these organisations which have like-minded people, people of colour interested in, for example, history, or whatever field that you're interested in. I think trying to seek out these places where you can feel heard and feel seen, because it can be quite daunting to walk into a lecture theatre like I did in first year, and there'd only be 3 or 4 black faces there. I don't let that put you off when you get to university and you find out that it's not very diverse. I think there are plenty of places you can go to find like-minded people. I think also that finding organisations and societies is incredibly important to help celebrate diversity.
Thank you. Those are both some really good points there. And then the final thing I wanted to talk about was student activism. So obviously the past year particularly, we've seen a massive increase in people getting involved in being activists and standing up for various issues. So what do you feel is the value of having this student activism, having it amongst the younger population rather than supposedly professional activists and things like that?
I think it's always good to be creating awareness, and I think that's what a lot of the student activism has done, which we've seen. There have been instances, of course, where you question whether it's more performative, particularly with maybe some more of the bigger organisations and them kind of just going with the flow as opposed to actually believing in what they're doing. And I think you do get some instances with young people activism where it is performative with so for example the black squares which people posted, and it was actually detrimental to the Black Lives movements and the work which activists had been doing for a long time. So I think while student activism is really important in creating awareness, I think students do need to take a critical look at the activism which they are doing and actually question, okay, will this really help the movement or will it make me look better? And I think that's something which, as young people, we always need to be thinking about before we post online.
Yeah, I completely agree. I also think that with any form of activism, you have to think about persistence as well. especially with things like Black Lives Matter, these things tend to be quite seasonal. They come and go with news cycles, and if you're looking at affecting any real meaningful change, it's not something that can be solved in a fortnight of protest. It's something that needs to be constant pressure needs to be applied to people in power to affect real meaningful systemic change, and it's not something that we can solve with a few hashtags or a few blacked out pictures. It's something that we've really got to be persistent on, and we can't, while we've all got a lot going on in our lives, it's not something that we can afford to put down and just say like wait for change to happen. It's something that we personally have to go out and affect.
Yeah, definitely.
But I just want to clarify, I wasn't trying to look down on those activisms at all, because I'm just looking back at it now. I think it's Angela Davies who mentioned that the kind of global activism which we witnessed this summer has never been seen on a scale before. Like, just how many people were inspired by Black Lives Matter. I think that couldn't have been brought about without young people's activism as well, and also which some of the organisations which have stepped forward, I think obviously we'll see in the future, but it does look like there has been quite a bit of change. And I'm particularly old, can't really, in my lifetime I haven't seen anything like this, but I haven't so far. And speaking to my parents and my grandparents, they haven't seen anything like this for a long time. So I think whilst there are flaws which we definitely need to address when looking at activism, we do need to appreciate the massive change which I do feel like is coming, and hope it will be realised.
So kind of going on from that, what would you say to any students or anyone watching really who wants to sort of get involved, wants to feel like they are being active in pushing for change? How would you recommend they go about doing that?
Well, like we said before, this level of protest was kind of only really made possible by social media. And while there are obvious pitfalls to the use of social media, and there are disadvantages to social media, as a student you can find any form of group that might interest you or be in your local area that you can get involved with. I think while social media is useful, it's a means to an end really, and you can use that as a sort of starting point to get involved in these groups.
And just following on from that, you can support local and national organisations such as the Young Historians Project, for the plug, and you can follow our social media channels. We have a Twitter, Instagram and a Facebook, and we also have a website which we have a donation point. It was great to see us get a lot more donations following the recent Black Lives Matter protests, and if we could keep that up, then those donations will really help us realise our project on African women in the British Health Service, which we hope to share with people early next year. So those kind of donations are ways which people can help support these organisations as well.
So you mentioned your current project on African women in the British Health Service. So what sort of inspired you to do that as the next project with the Young Historians Project?
Yeah, well, our first project was on the Black Liberation Front, and that one went really well, but something which the project noticed was that we focused a lot on men, and we also focused a lot on Caribbean men, and it was only till after the project was finished that we actually found an African lady who had been part of the Black Liberation Front as well. So we noticed that we'd really missed a crucial group, and we wanted to make sure that our next project focused on them and gave them the representation which they deserved. And recently there'd been a lot of discussion of Windrush with the anniversary and this so-called Windrush nurse, and we noticed that within that narrative the contributions of African women were being left out because of the focus on Windrush. So it was only about Caribbean nurses really, and when documentaries, films and books would talk about the black nurse, they were only really talking about the Caribbean nurse. So we decided that our next project would look at African women in the British Health Service throughout the 20th century. And we really wanted to show that African women had been here before the NHS as well, because it was quite a common myth that a lot of African women came later on, when really we found evidence of them in the early 20th century, possibly even the 19th century. So that was, it was really important for us to make sure we represented this story, because we couldn't see it in popular media, and we certainly didn't include these women in our last project, and it was really important for us to do it this time.
Just to tie that back to the curriculum as well, when you look at just the representation of black women in healthcare, not necessarily African women, but black women, I guarantee you, I could only really think of Mary Seacole, who is sort of propped up as this representation of the contribution of black women to healthcare in this country, and even then her position is contested quite frequently, especially by organisations like the Florence Nightingale Foundation, who frequently contest her contribution in the Crimean War. I think the project's important in broadening the field, in making sure that we kind of get away from almost hagiographizing people like Mary Seacole, and making sure that the contribution of these women is actually realised when it's been a hidden history almost. And I think that's the name of the project, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think it's quite important to actually get these stories out there, especially when we look at today the contribution of women of African descent and the sacrifices that these people make. I mean, we look at quite topical. We look at coronavirus, and we look at the fact that the black women and their contributions to the NHS are disproportionately being affected by this crisis. And then we look back historically, and we see that these women have always been there, and we haven't told these stories. So I think it's important to get that out there.
Some really good points there again. So yeah, I guess that's it from me really. I just want to say thank you for talking to me, and good luck with the project in the future. I really wish you the best of luck with that.
Thank you.
So
Cheers,
thank
thanks.
you.